Week 14 of the fantasy football season. Here's the top 36 wide receivers I'm ranking this week. Number 1, Ja'Marr Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. Joe Burrow returned to the lineup last week. Him and Chase didn't miss a beat. 7 catches, 100 yards in that one in Baltimore. And this week at the Buffalo Bills, we know Chase, he's been a stud receiver all season long. He's locked in. Number 2, Jackson Smith-Njigba of the Seattle Seahawks. I know JSN, he had his worst game of the season, but this year he's been putting up big numbers. And that game was out of reach early and often, where the Vikings turned it over very quickly and they didn't have to throw the football with Seattle. So this week, I think this will be more of a competitive game, even though I think the Seahawks still win this one pretty easily, but it'll land on the fast track. JSN's due for a bounce back. Number 3, Puka Nacua of the Los Angeles Rams. So Puka Nacua, I know the numbers have gone down a little bit over the last few weeks. I know Davante Adams, he's been the touchdown machine this season with 14 on the year in the receiving room for this Ram team. But Puka Nacua, he makes it look easy. Him and Stafford have been locked in since he's been a rookie as Puka Nacua. And I think this week at the Arizona Cardinals indoor ball game, which is always a plus, he could go out there and have a big game versus bad secondary. Number 4, CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys. So this Cowboy team, they're putting up a lot of points and they're on a winning streak now, coming off beating Philadelphia and the Kansas City Chiefs. And this week they travel on Thursday night at the Detroit Lions. So CeeDee Lamb, he had a bad game in Week 12 versus the Philadelphia Eagles, but then bounced back with a big game last week versus the Chiefs, over 100 yards and a touchdown. So this week at Detroit, where they're banged up in the secondary pretty badly, I think Lamb could have his way in this one. Number 5, Rashee Rice of the Kansas City Chiefs. So Rashee Rice, ever since off suspension, he's having a big season. Him and Mahomes have been on the same page, and he's just one of the best wide receivers, in my opinion, in pro football, is Rashee Rice. So last week, a big game versus the Cowboys, 90 yards, found the end zone twice. And this week, I know it's a tougher matchup with one of the better defenses coming in the league in Houston, but I still think Rice goes out there and he'll put up his numbers. Number 6, Davante Adams of the Los Angeles Rams. So he's not getting a lot of yards, but when you're getting 1 or 2 touchdowns per game over the last month of the season, you don't need the yards. So this week at Arizona, like I said earlier, defense that can't stop anyone, one of the worst secondaries in the league. I think this Ram team, after coming off a bad loss at Carolina, bounced back in a big way, and both these receivers have big games. Number 7, George Pickens of the Dallas Cowboys. George Pickens having a monster first season with the Dallas Cowboys, and you would think this Cowboy team, they'll back up the money truck for Pickens this offseason. So this week at Detroit, like I said, secondary's banged up, and Pickens one-on-one coverage, most corners all season long have had trouble. So him and Dak Prescott, they've been locked in from the get-go this season. And this week on the fast track on Thursday night, usually high-scoring games, I think Pickens has another good game this week. Number 8, A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles. A.J. Brown, he's starting to get things going over the last couple weeks here. I know he complained a lot to the media. He wants the football, he wants to make plays, but the funny thing is, ever since he made a big stink, this Eagle team 0-2, even though he's getting into his numbers. So this week, okay matchup with the Chargers. I don't think their defense is all that great. And like I said, at this point, it's Jalen Hurts force-feeding A.J. Brown, that he don't have to hear him, I think, at times as well. Number 9, Nico Collins of the Houston Texans. So another solid year it's been for Nico Collins. I know he got off to a slow start early in the season, but the last few weeks, he's getting his 80, 90 yards, found in the end zone more weeks than not. And him and C.J. Stroud have been locked in since Stroud's rookie season, going back a few years ago. So I know this week a tougher matchup with the Chiefs, one of the better defenses in the league. And McDuffie a solid corner, even though last week CeeDee Lamb had his way with him. But I think Collins, regardless, he'll go out there and get his numbers. Number 10, Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons. So this week it is a tough matchup if London returns to the lineup. He's going to try to give it a go this week as Drake London. We know he's one of the better receivers in the league. And him and Kirk Cousins had a good season last season together. So with Cousins obviously back in the lineup the last few weeks, where Penix is out for the year, the rapport will be there with these guys, but this is going to be a tough matchup. And if they are chasing points and London does play, he'll work his way into production. Number 11, Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints. It's been a solid year for Olave, and we know he's a good wide receiver. Just health has been an issue for him the last 2 seasons. And this week in a matchup, they'll be chasing points, most likely at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I still think Olave, he could go out there and have a good game, and he's the number 1 target easily, where Tyler Shuck, the rookie, he just keeps targeting Olave. And like I said, they're trailing in all these ball games where volume's going to be there. Number 12, T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. So T. Higgins, he was out last week with a concussion. So far, he's still in the protocol. And if he doesn't play, then Andre Oshivash will fill in once again at receiver. And he wouldn't be ranked in my top 36. But Higgins, we'll see if he plays this week. practice yet to open up. Obviously, tomorrow practices open up for teams playing on Sunday, and this is a good matchup with the Buffalo Bills. I know the Bills, they did a good job, but that was the Pittsburgh Steelers offense. It's not a good offense in my opinion. So if Higgins is back, it's a good matchup at Buffalo, and I think he could go out there and make plays. 13, Jameson Williams of the Detroit Lions. So I'm assuming Amon-Ra St. Brown, he's not going to play this week. He didn't practice Monday and Tuesday. Is St. Brown. They didn't rule him out yet, but it's not looking good, obviously. And if St. Brown guts it out and does play, which it wouldn't be surprising to me if he does, as St. Brown, he'd be a guy in that top 6-7 range to me this week. But right now, like I said, it's not looking good. He missed the first 2 practices of the week. It's not sounding optimistic he's going to play as well. So Jameson Williams will bump up, and we saw the damage he did last week when he was the number 1 wide receiver pretty much the whole game, where St. Brown went out in the first drive of the game where he went over 140 yards and found the end zone and left some points on the table as well, where he dropped a few passes. So this week versus secondary that I still don't think is good, with DaRon Bland and even Trevon Diggs possibly returning, Williams could go out there and put up points. And like I said, with St. Brown down and Sam Laporta, who's been out once again, there's not much going on there where he's going to get peppered with targets. 14, Ladd McConkey of the Los Angeles Chargers. So Justin Herbert, I think he's going to play in this game. He got the surgery on his left hand. It's Justin Herbert, and we saw he played throughout that game versus the Vegas Raiders with the injury in last week's game. In the pistol formation and shotgun, he was running the majority of that game. So this week it is a tougher matchup. Philadelphia coming in Monday Night Football, but we've seen this secondary over the last couple weeks be a little leaky, and teams move up and down the field versus him. 15, Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins. So Jalen Waddle, we know he's the number 1 wide receiver over there ever since Tyreek Hill went down first month of the season with the injury. And Jalen Waddle's had some good games, and some games he hasn't done much. But this week, a pretty good matchup at the New York Jets, where this Jet defense obviously traded Sauce Gardner away, Michael Carter away, 2 main secondary pieces. And I think Waddle could go out there and put in good receiver 2 numbers. 16, Emeka Egbuka of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So Emeka Egbuka, definitely the last few weeks his numbers are taking a hit, and maybe he's still not 100% after he sustained that hamstring injury about a month ago as Emeka Egbuka and played through it. So this week it is a good matchup. New Orleans Saints coming in. This Tampa Bay offense getting healthy. Bucky Irvin returned last week, and Chris Godwin the last couple weeks returned, played more snaps in last week's ball game in the victory versus the Arizona Cardinals. So I think Egbuka versus a bad secondary this week could bounce back. 17, Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. So there's a good shot. J.J. McCarthy returns to the lineup, but pretty much Jefferson, 10-15 fantasy points weekly at most. He's been getting fantasy owners. Last week he just laid an egg, but Max Brosmer, one of the worst quarterbacks in all pro football, turned the football over 5 times in that game, and him and Jefferson couldn't get anything going. But this week it's a pretty good matchup versus the Commanders, where we saw Courtland Sutton go out there and have a good ball game last week. So I think Justin Jefferson this week, he could bounce back. And obviously it's anything better than the 1 fantasy point he scored last week. 18, Devonta Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles. So Devonta Smith, it's been a solid season for him. I know some weeks he's not going to do much, and then some weeks you see him explode for that 20, 25 fantasy points. But this week it's a good matchup at the Los Angeles Chargers. Their defense is middle of the pack, and Devonta Smith, he could go out there, he could run the routes, he can make the plays, and obviously a big deep ball threat and an indoor game as well. Instead of dealing with the cold Philly weather, is a plus. 19, Marvin Harrison Jr. of the Arizona Cardinals. So Marvin Harrison, he returned last week. He had a solid game, 9 catches, 69 yards in that one. And this week it's a matchup versus the Rams where they're going to be chasing points. I know Harrison banged up a little bit with a heel injury, but I think he's going to give it a go this week. And him and Brissett definitely have a good rapport. 20, Courtland Sutton of the Denver Broncos. So Sutton finally had a big game where for multiple weeks he pretty much was non-existent fantasy numbers. And last week in Washington, he had over 70 yards and found the end zone. Was Courtland Sutton. But still, this Bronco team, I think they want to run the football a whole lot. Now Evan Ingram, he got more involved in the offense last week, where he had the best game of the year for him with this Denver Bronco team. And this could be a game of Vegas where they're off to an early start and run the clock out in the second half. 21, Jacoby Myers of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So Myers, he's been a good trade deadline acquisition for this Jacksonville Jaguar team. And right now, in my opinion, he's the number 1 wide receiver over there for this Jaguar team, where Brian Thomas hasn't done anything all season long. Parker Washington, he's banged up, and he's more of a slot. And Myers, he's definitely looked like the player he did last season in Vegas. And this year, we know the man did a trade out early in the season but it didn't happen till the deadline. So this week in a potential high-scoring game versus Indianapolis, I think you go out there and give you decent stats. 22 Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. So last week, everyone besides Derrick Henry had a horrible ball game for this Baltimore Raven team, where Flowers, he had 0.6, I think, fantasy points in that ball game. So this week in a tough division matchup versus the Pittsburgh Steelers, this is for first place, 6-6. Both these teams are in the AFC South in that division. So I think Zay Flowers, he'll bounce back this week. And this Steelers secondary, they definitely have a great name, but teams are still going out there and putting points on the board and putting up some numbers. 23, Michael Pittman of the Indianapolis Colts. So the last couple of weeks, he's taken a little bit of a back seat. Is Michael Pittman in this offense? And this offense has struggled a little bit as well over the last few weeks. We know Daniel Jones not 100%, playing with a broken fibula, where he's a tough guy, obviously gutting it out, where they lost a tough one in last week's ball game. And also as well, Alec Pierce, he stepped up this season, and Tyler Warren, one of the better tight ends in the league. But this week in a potential high-scoring game and good weather in Jacksonville, I like Pittman to bounce back. 24, Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders. The talent's obviously never been a concern with Terry McLaurin. It's been about health, and this season he's missed a ton of games for McLaurin, and also as well with him holding out all the training camp didn't help until he got his contract, but rightfully so. So this week a pretty decent matchup at the Minnesota Vikings. This secondary, they definitely got some players, but they have their lapses at times. And also as well, this offense puts their defense in bad positions, whether on the field too much or in bad field position. So with those factors, I think Terry McLaurin could go out there and have a good game. And last week we saw him in bad weather conditions and a ripped up field where grass was coming up throughout that ball game. He had 22.5 fantasy points in PPR leagues. 25, Alec Pierce of the Indianapolis Colts. Alec Pierce, last week a big game. It's a contract season for Pierce, and he's been a good option in this offense. Him and Daniel Jones have a good rapport, and he's shown this season he's more than a deep ball threat. So this week in a high-scoring game, possibly at Jacksonville, I like Pierce as a receiver too for fantasy owners. 26, Christian Watson of the Green Bay Packers. So Christian Watson, to me, the only viable option in the passing game in terms of fantasy football weekly for this Green Bay Packer team. Romeo Doubs, he's been hit or miss. Matthew Golden's been a bust so far in his rookie season. And Jaden Reed possibly could return this week to the lineup, but he'll be on a snap count, I believe. So this week versus Chicago, where their defense has definitely improved over the last few weeks, but still this could be a high-scoring game. I like Watson to go out there once again and have a decent ball game. 27, Deebo Samuel of the Washington Commanders. So this week, pretty decent matchup in Minnesota. Fast track. Deebo made a big play last week to get him to the 1 yard line was this Washington Commander team, and they played a good game last week. And now, obviously, with the offense healthy, and we'll see if Jaden Daniels plays in this game, even though it's not looking probable right now where they're out of it. Why would you rush a franchise quarterback back? I still think Deebo and Marcus Mariota have good rapport, and he could have an okay game this week. 28, Rome Odunze of the Chicago Bears. So the first month of the season looked like one of the better receivers in fantasy football. But this offense now, they've really gone to a run-first approach with two solid running backs in DeAndre Swift and Kyle Monangai over the last month of the season. So everyone's numbers in this offense is taking a hit. And at Green Bay, where they're one of the better defenses in the league, I don't think Odunze ceiling is that high this week as well. 29, Khalil Shakir of the Buffalo Bills. So Shakir, the number one option in this passing game for this Buffalo Bill team. With Dalton Kincaid, he's been out multiple weeks right now for this Buffalo Bill team. And Shakir, he's a wide receiver that could run all the routes. He has good hands, but also this Bill team the last couple weeks, they're looking to run the football a little bit more with James Cook. And obviously as well, Josh Allen, one of the better running quarterbacks in the league. But this week, a slam dunk matchup with Cincinnati coming in. Number 30, DK Metcalf for the Pittsburgh Steelers. So this offense has been a mess pretty much all season long. DK Metcalf's been a touchdown-dependent wide receiver all season long as well. And pretty much if he hasn't scored a touchdown, 8-10 fantasy points at best, he's going to give bonus. So this week, it's an all right matchup for Baltimore. But like I said, the ceiling just isn't high in my opinion for Metcalf. 31, Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So this week, a good matchup versus Saints. Godwin last week looked like he had more pep in his step, looked a little bit quicker, and maybe he's almost close to being 100% healthy. I know Mike Evans, he might try to practice this week, and we'll see if that happens. But even if he does, I don't think he'll return this week. More of a Week 15, Week 16 return. So Chris Godwin is number 2 receiver behind Emeka Egbuka this week. I think in a good matchup could go out there and help fantasy owners. 32, Quentin Johnston of the Los Angeles Chargers. So like I said, I think Herbert's going to play this week's ball game. He's coming off the left-hand surgery, but played last week with the injury throughout that ball game. And this week it is a tough matchup versus the Philadelphia Eagles, even though the last couple weeks secondaries had a little bit leakage. But Quentin Johnson, for the most part, he's been a touchdown or bust type of wide receiver. But this week I think he could go out there and be serviceable in a game where they could be chasing points. 33, Brian Thomas Jr., the Jacksonville Jaguars. He's been one of the biggest busts in fantasy football this season, has been Brian Thomas Jr. Injuries, dropping passes, and not producing. And that would, in my opinion, Jacoby Myers is the better option in this receiving room than Thomas Jr. His upside isn't high, even though this could be a high-scoring game versus the Colts. 34, Jaden Higgins of the Houston Texans. So Jaden Higgins, he's definitely taken the next step in the second half of his rookie season, where 3 out of 4 games now he's had double-digit fantasy points. He's the number 2 option in the receiving room, where Christian Kirk, Xavier Hutchinson haven't given much to this Texan team. And pretty much this offense in the passing games, Nico Collins, Schultz, the number 2 option, and Higgins, the number 3 option. So this week in a matchup where they could be chasing points, even though we know this Texan defense is a great defense at Kansas City, Higgins could go out there once again, have a good ball game. 35, Xavier Worthy staying in the same game of the Kansas City Chiefs. Xavier Worthy last week, he had a nice 40-yard play on a broken play. But the thing is with Worthy, I want to see him being used more as a deep ball threat, and obviously that hasn't come to fruition this season. So this week in a tougher matchup versus Houston, where I think they're going to roll double coverage at times with safety over the top versus Rashee Rice, that could get one-on-one coverage Worthy and maybe could beat his matchup this week. In the 36th and final receiver on rankings, Michael Wilson of the Arizona Cardinals. I've said it all season long, when Harrison Jr. is in the lineup, Wilson's failed to reach double-digit fantasy points this season. But this week could be a matchup where they're down very quickly, 10, 14 points, and have to throw the football majority of the game with the Los Angeles Rams coming in. So like I said, Wilson had some big games when Harrison was out, but with him in the lineup, he's a low ceiling 7 to 9 fantasy point guy. So that's the top 36 wide receivers I'm ranking for week 14 of the fantasy football season.